When European colonial powers arrived in a new area, they brought with them certain beliefs and preconceptions about how the world worked. Existing social relations, whether in Latin America or Asia, were interpreted in the context of the European experience. Europe was thus read into the colony. Local political authority was cast in the context of European monarchies, and European ideas about social order were used to rethink domestic relations in the colonies. This process, the social and political reorganization of the colonies, had widespread implications, particularly on gender relations in the colony. And it's this aspect that we'll consider now. It's difficult to speak about broad topics like gender and colonization in a meaningful way. Remember that pre-colonial societies were incredibly diverse. Some, like the San in South Africa, were effectively stateless nomads, wandering from region to region with little central political authority. The Igbo in Nigeria had a system of politically autonomous villages, each operating as a distinct unit, but with connections to other neighboring autonomous villages. Others, like the Kingdom of Songhai in modern Mali, or the Aztecs and the Incas in Latin America, were much closer to European empires, centralizing political authority over a vast expanse of land, constructing roads, managing trade and religion, and generally exercising all the trappings of sovereignty we associate with the state. Social relations were equally varied. In some, gender relations were relatively equitable, with women exercising considerable political authority. In others, strongly patriarchal relations defined women's role in society in incredibly narrow ways. In order to make sense of how colonialism interacted with existing social orders, it's useful to consider a specific case. Take, for example, the Shona in modern Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe was colonized by the British in the waning years of the 19th century. When they arrived in Zimbabwe, which they called Southern Rhodesia, they encountered the Shona, a people with a great tradition of empire themselves, and other groups like the Ndebele, in smaller numbers. The Shona had been the predominant power of the region, controlling neighboring groups like the Ndebele, and building from the 12th to the 14th century the Great Zimbabwe, a model city so advanced that Rhodesian settlers went to great pains to prove that it could not have been built by black Africans. All that remains of the Great Zimbabwe today is the massive stone enclosure pictured here. But at its peak, the Great Zimbabwe was home to an estimated 18,000 people and boasted walls some 30 feet high. The social relations of the Shona were particularly complex. While women in pre-colonial Zimbabwe were structurally subordinate to men, some were able to exercise considerable political and economic power, most often through informal channels. Gradually, however, the British settlers sought to restructure the social and political order of Zimbabwe. Having arrived searching for gold and diamonds, the British settlers were disappointed to learn that there was little of either. Remember that the purpose of colonization, particularly in the case of Zimbabwe, as colonization was driven by a private corporation there, the British South Africa Company, was to generate profit. There was, however, considerable copper and rich agricultural land in Zimbabwe, but making use of either required extensive labor, and there were few British settlers willing to undertake either the dangerous work in the mines or the back-breaking labor of the fields. Instead, British colonial authorities sought to find ways to compel Africans to work for them. As Betsy Schmidt notes in her outstanding history of the period, colonial capital and the state attempted to construct a system in which young African men served as migrant wage laborers in the European economy, African women engaged in agricultural production in the reserves, and older African men maintained law and order at the village and household levels. Perhaps not surprisingly, this represented a considerable reconstruction of social relations in the colony. The first, and perhaps most fundamental task facing colonial authorities, was how to compel unwilling Africans to accept dangerous and low-paid work. Most African communities were self-sufficient, producing everything they needed within the local area. To overcome this, colonial authorities authorized a variety of taxes intended to compel young men into the mines and onto the farms. Taxes were introduced on the house, so-called hut taxes, on cattle in the form of dipping fees, and on families in the form of wife tax. But the new taxes themselves were generally ineffective. Because European settlers, especially in the early years, were unable to produce sufficient food for themselves, they were forced to rely on agricultural goods purchased from local communities. Particularly around the colonial capital of Salisbury, now Harare, peasant producers were in the position to expand their agricultural production and sell food and beer to white merchants and the black migrant laborers from neighboring countries, most notably Zambia and Mozambique. As Schmidt describes it, through the sale of their agricultural products, African households were able to earn enough cash to pay their taxes and to buy consumer goods, without suffering the out-migration of their male members into the wage economy. Shona women, as the primary agricultural producers, played a dominant role in the peasant response. It should be noted, however, that the ability of female farmers to meet the tax obligations imposed by the colonial state was ultimately undermined through legislation limiting their productive activities. Ultimately, men were forced into colonial labor markets. Perhaps more importantly, however, colonialism also resulted in the restructuring of the avenues of political authority in Zimbabwe. The colonial state elevated local political leaders while simultaneously eroding forms of power and authority traditionally exercised by women. Remember that European societies at the time generally viewed women as perpetual minors, incapable of making their own decisions and generally dependent on their husbands, father, or other male relative for care. British settlers brought with them these ideas and applied them in spades to the colonial subject. If European women were perpetual minors, then African women were even more so. Colonial policy forbade African women in Zimbabwe from engaging in dangerous professions, including those of brewer, healer, or midwife. The only professions open to women were as domestic laborers in white households. The political and social position of women in Zimbabwean society was further eroded by the increasing reliance on customary laws. Eager to reassert a degree of control in a rapidly changing context, some African leaders, particularly older men, supported colonial policies limiting the movement of women. New laws, called runaway wife laws, were based on dubious claims of traditional authority and custom. These laws forbade women from traveling in towns and cities without their husband's permission. Such laws were, according to Schmidt, an effort by senior African men to control the sexuality of African women through their monopoly on women, the sexuality and reproductive capacities of junior men. European women, in turn, attempted to control their husband's sexuality by keeping African women at a distance, while European men feared the sexual potency of their African counterparts. Perceiving the entire colonial system to be threatened by the unrestrained sexuality of African women and their partners, the colonial state joined senior African men in their efforts to control their women. In this sense, many of the claims to traditional authority that excluded women from the political sphere were in fact recent inventions stemming from the struggle over the authority under the colonial regime. Today, gender equity remains an elusive goal, not just in developing countries but around the world. While some countries have achieved a remarkable degree of equality, for example in terms of equal representation of women in national legislature, considerable gender inequality remains. Let's look at a couple of examples. As of 2012, women held an average of 19.7% of all seats in legislatures around the world. Rwanda ranked first, with women comprising 56.3% of the seats in the lower house. The United States, by way of comparison, ranked 78th overall, with 16.9% of female representation in the House and 17% in the Senate. You can see figures for other countries here. What's interesting about these results is that there's no clear-cut pattern correlating with development. Some developing countries have high levels of female representation, others have relatively low levels. The same is true for developed countries. We can also consider levels of economic inequality by gender. The United Nations Development Program Gender Inequality Index, or GII, is one way to think about gender equality. The GII is a composite index intended to measure the degree to which women can equitably and actively participate in the economic and political life of the country. It includes 5 indicators focused on reproductive health, education, parliamentary representation, and labor market participation. In theory, scores on the index range from 0 to 1, but most countries fall between 0.8 in Sweden, reflecting relative equality, and 0.45 in Yemen, reflecting a high degree of gender inequality. The top and bottom countries, as well as national averages, reflected here. What's interesting about this chart, which graphs the relationship between the Gender Inequality Index on the x-axis and GDP per capita on the y-axis, is the clear positive correlation that exists between the two. As countries develop, the level of gender inequality tends to decline, reflected here by an increasing GII score. We'll return to this relationship later in the course.